We are talking today to Betsy Hartmann. She teaches at the Hampshire College in the United States. But more than that, she's been a long-standing activist in the women's health movement and someone who's done a lot of work on issues related to population. Now, Betsy, I understand that there is this big issue now, especially in the United States, about linking the whole population issue with the issue of the climate crisis, and thereby, in a way, the population bogey being again brought back into public discourse. And you're someone who's worked on it, so can we start and get your views on that?
Yes, unfortunately, we're seeing a resurgence of these population control ideology in the media, among some policymakers and among some people in the environmental and family planning movements. So the argument goes that overpopulation is the main cause of climate change, and therefore family planning, either of the voluntary type or the Chinese type, is the solution. So we're very concerned to see this resurgence again. We think it could be detrimental to both reproductive rights and detrimental to coming up with a good climate policy for the United States.
And what forms are this resurgence taking?
Well, some of the mainstream population lobby groups are arguing this in Washington, D.C. Some of them want increased assistance for international family planning after the Bush era, where there were a lot of attacks on international family planning. And so they reckon that if they use this kind of argument, they'll get support from people in Congress, they'll get more public support, so kind of build up a fear of overpopulation again using the climate change
and what are the scenarios that are being sort of put forward?
Well, it's, I mean, they vary, but one of them is that, unless basically with climate change, and this is kind of a national security spin that also comes in with another group of folks interested in this issue, the national security people, that climate change is going to lead to hundreds of thousands or millions of climate refugees coming and storming our border, and could, by creating ever more resource scarcities in places like Africa, lead to climate conflict. And there's even been a move to blame the profoundly political conflict in Darfur and Sudan on climate change and overpopulation. So we find that a worry. The other sector that's really taking up this issue is Malthusian environmentalists. Unfortunately, we have a number of them in the United States, people like Paul Ehrlich of the Population Bomb, writing this stuff again. So you get some kind of key pundits, both environmental, national security, population pundits, saying these kinds of messages.
Would this also be part of U.S. National policy in that sense, of deflecting attention away from the fact that the U.S. needs to cut down its emissions and consumption?
Well, I don't think there's some conspiracy to do that, but it certainly has that effect in that, it's diverting attention to the poor people in the global south having too many babies causing climate change, rather than looking, for example, the U.S. is the largest emitter of carbon historically, right? So, and taking the onus off looking at ourselves and our own consumption and our systems of production and distribution that are one of the major causes of climate change in the world today. So,
and would there be sort of mainstream environmental groups who would be promoting this notion of overpopulation being the central issue in climate change?
Well, the Sierra Club, for example, has their population program. It's been calling for population justice, they call it, which means that, if you give women family planning and empower them, this will help mitigate climate change. Using those kinds of arguments. There was also another group, quite well known, the NRDC, tends to do a lot of good work on many issues, but it had an article in its journal saying that climate refugees from Bangladesh were going to come into India and they were going to all be Islamic terrorists. So we're finding some of that language too. And I don't think, a lot of the environmental groups are probably a bit divided on this subject, and probably more worrying than the groups themselves are these pundits who get a lot of play in the press.
Does this go beyond the United States in other countries in the North? Similar kind of a debate?
Yeah, you're seeing it in the United Kingdom particularly, I would say. There's a group there called the Optimum Population Trust that even has gone to the ludicrous extent of having on its website you can figure out your carbon emissions when you take a holiday, and then you can pay to offset those carbon emissions by giving Optimum Population Trust money for international family planning. So, but they've, aside from that kind of ludicrous action, they've been putting a lot of energy into. They did a study that purportedly showed that kind of the cheapest and most efficient way to alleviate global warming was to invest in family planning rather than green technologies.
And does this in any way, you think, detract from initiatives to have a more inclusive way of looking at the whole issue of climate change?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think it, again, it's putting blame mainly on people in the global south, but even to some extent also in women in the north were being told, having children is bad for climate change and bad for the planet. So it's putting this kind of burden and onus on women's fertility instead of looking at really the systemic causes of climate change and also the possible solutions to climate change. So in a way, it's a very dispiriting development. I should say it's not the dominant force in climate politics in the U.S., but it is rearing its ugly head again.
Okay, just to change track a bit, all of us were privy to Barack Obama in Copenhagen being one of the people who were perhaps responsible in the northern countries not taking major responsibility for the climate crisis. Now, in the US, is there a movement or are there people who are really concerned of the US position vis-a-vis the global debate on climate crisis and the fact that the US is not doing enough on it?
Yes, there are many people actually, and there's a growing kind of climate movement of, has different aspects, but kind of on the more progressive edge is the climate justice movement, which calls for solutions to climate change that also improve equity and environmental justice at the same time, looking at kind of the role of, for example, the fossil fuel industry in causing toxic pollution in poor communities, so that you can address, reduction in carbon emissions and also reduction in pollution will help these communities. And you have young people really organizing, saying we've got to cap U.S. carbon emissions. There's a movement called the 350 movement, and there are young people sleeping out on the streets protesting. There's a group called Rising Tide that does kind of direct action. And so and in the policy world, there are a number of people trying to come up with a carbon capping policy that would lead to the most kind of equitable distribution of those resources possible. That's a big kind of political debate within Washington and also within states like California. Interestingly, it's kind of on the state level that we might see the more advances on climate policy. So some state governments like California, for example, are taking seriously the need to cap carbon emissions.
Just a final question, if I were to ask you to guess, when do you think in the US there would be a critical mass which would actually be able to impact upon US policy regarding climate change?
Well, it depends which side of the bed I wake up in the morning. Sometimes I get quite depressed, but about the possibility for social movements in the U.S. But I think we have to remember that they are alive and well, and people are capable of coming forward. And climate change actually presents an amazing opportunity because it's a way, not only do we need to address climate change, but we really need to rethink how our economy works in terms of coming up with a kind of green, just transition. And there's some very interesting work being done on what this concretely would look like. And so I would say that there's a lot of room for hope and not just despair. And just one other thing I'd like to point out about the military use of climate change. This is something that also is concerning, and I think we need to be paying attention to, is that the certain defense interests in the U.S. and the UK and Germany also are painting climate change as a national security threat, and using, again, the kind of population language that these people are climate refugees, are going to overrun us, and therefore that, and also it's being used as a pretext also for the setting up of things like AFRICOM, the African Military Command, and also for the greater takeover of humanitarian aid by military interests and defense interests. So I think we have to watch carefully too, as much as we want climate change to be a central focus, we have to look at the ways in which it's being used by different actors, and some of this national security and climate change discourse is extremely worrying.
Thank you, Betsy. And
Thank
you
you
for talking to us.
Thank you.